Good morning. It is Sunday. Thank God it's Sunday, March the 20th, and this is The Drill. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare, the Pledge of Allegiance, and the Star-Spangled Banner, we will have no free lunch and the second part of Chapter 1 of the book Shadowbosses, about public employee unions and how they ruin our government and rob the taxpayers. All that and more when I come back. Thank you. And now the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare for March the 20th. You will bind the enemy and strip him of his power. When my son sent 72 of his servants out 2 by 2 to bring them the good news of the gospel, they returned in joyful surprise that even demons submitted to them when they used his name. So do not be surprised that I have given you the power to bind the enemy and strip him of his power. He was already stripped of his power in heaven, and I saw him fall like lightning from heaven. I'm sending you to open the eyes of those who are spiritually blind, in order to turn them from darkness to light and from the power of Satan to me. Then I will forgive their sins and give them an inheritance of righteousness. Exodus chapter 15, verses 6 and 7, Luke chapter 10, verses 17 through 19, and Acts chapter 26, verse 18. Prayer declaration. Satan, the Lord rebukes you. Through his power I will bruise Satan under my feet. I bind and rebuke all hindering spirits of Satan in the name of Jesus. I will not be terrified of Satan and his demons when they fight against me. For God himself is with me and will rescue me. Because of the power of Christ at work within me, I have overcome Satan and have stripped him of his power over me. Amen. And that was the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare for March the 20th. Thank you. Who is the true conservative? He is religious and realistic. He is the person that understands that culture is the foundation for politics. He acknowledges a benevolent universe. He is patriotic and uses common sense. He makes judgments, refuses to speculate, speaks clearly and definitively, and is not afraid to say no. He's open-minded, asking why rather than why not. He is consistent, credible, and influential, not ashamed of his existence, unafraid to learn or correct his mistakes. He is a normal American. Thank you, thank you. What are the tactics in support of the strategy to rid America of socialist influence? The long-term tactics are to be a true conservative, talk like a conservative, act like a conservative, dress like a conservative, and think like a conservative. The short-term tactics are rhetorical. True conservatives need to win all of the arguments. That means don't prove a negative. Don't take their word for it. Don't be neutral, and ask plenty of questions. Thank you, thank you. What is the true conservative strategy for defeating socialists in this country? Socialists must be driven from positions of power, and since it is lefty counterculture that provides the foundation for their political success, true conservatives must resist left-wing counterculture and promote normal American culture. By changing our culture, we will change our politics. And by changing the culture, we mean you need to get married, have a family, and raise your children. Thank you, thank you. What are the true conservative political priorities? Number 1, the abolition of abortion throughout the land. Number 2, to make nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons obsolete. Number 3, the immediate decertification of all public employee unions. Number 4, the immediate assignment of criminal and civil liabilities to all government regulators. Number 5, the immediate repeal of the so-called Patriot Act. Number 6, the immediate repeal of all so-called emergency dictator laws. Thank you, thank you. Now there's no free lunch. Quote, in the realm of public policy, it is important to insist that principle be upheld in the face of expediency. Arguments for expediency understate the true cost of public policy because they neglect the beneficial outcomes of what would have occurred under a general principle of freedom. The proposed benefits of the expedient path are concrete, but the costs are unseen, unquote. Peter J. Betka. A failure to appreciate the knowledge problem allows expediency to take over and promotes policymakers doing what is easy and palatable versus what is right. Unseen costs are ignored because to analyze or discover them would be hard, but they are inevitable because of the knowledge problem. This dilemma is inescapable when power and control are given to those whom lack the knowledge, and vested interest is put the hard over the easy. And again, I've said the similar things where I've said if you're going to make the argument, you always want to argue as much from principle. That's your primary argument. You want to, if somebody's proposing a particular public policy, you want to be able to say if you're arguing against it, you want to be able to say it's unconstitutional. That should be your first argument. It's unconstitutional, can't do it. Thanks anyways. Okay, instead of saying, well, we can't afford it, or it's going to lead to corruption or something of that nature, because then when you do it from practical or expedience, make your argument, that your opponent is going to respond with an expedient answer or a practical answer, such as when you say it's too expensive, they will simply say, we'll raise taxes. Now you're sucked in. Now you have no choice. You have to support their proposal. If it's single payer and you say, well, too expensive, we'll raise taxes, you're screwed. That's all there's to it. If you say it's unconstitutional and it costs too much, now you got something going. So use principle as your primary argument, the expedient as a secondary or tertiary argument. But anyways, that was There's No Free Lunch. Thank you. And now we are going to be finishing up Chapter 1 of the Shadowbosses, how public employee unions control America and rob taxpayers. Monopoly bargaining over government workers. In most private businesses, you bargain for yourself. No group has the monopoly power to bargain for you. If you get an offer to be an insurance broker at business on Main Street, you will negotiate with the owner of the business over your starting salary, relocation expenses, health insurance contributions, company car, and other benefits. Then, a year after you've taken the job, when a rival firm makes you an offer to jump ship and go to work for them, you renegotiate with your original employer for better terms. You're responsible for setting your working conditions with your employer. Nobody does it for you. Now, imagine instead that you've decided to take the job that we've been talking about as a policeman in San Diego. When you're hired for that job, you're given the union-negotiated contract that specifies your pay, benefits, and nearly every aspect of your job. The union is your exclusive bargaining representative in almost all matters involving your job. This is not a service that they perform for you. It is a power they hold over you. You are not even allowed to speak with your employer about any matter involving your job without the union doing the speaking for you. To the union, you are not an individual but a member of a bargaining unit, a group of employees that are represented by the same union and bound by the same union negotiated contract. Whether you like it or not, you are part of a collective, a group of people that are dealt with only as a group. The union bargains for all of you as though you are identical widgets. Collective bargaining burdens. Unions like to talk about the right to collective bargaining, but it is no right. Collective bargaining is what happens to you when you your actual right to sell your own labor is taken away from you and given instead to a government employee union. There's nothing wrong with individual workers deciding that they want to be members of a labor union. Free association is the essence of American republicanism. Workers have the right to join a union, a church, or any lawful assembly, as do all Americans. But with government employee unions, usually an earlier group of workers selected the union and made the choice to unionize. This election may have taken place 40 or 50 years ago, but the union still has the power to represent all current and future workers until the union is decertified, which rarely happens. The union's collective bargaining power tramples the worker's right to sell his own labor. Current workers didn't choose to bargain with their employers collectively. The union is already representing them whether they want it or not. When it comes to employment, your relationship with the employer is supposed to be consensual. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution bars slavery and involuntary servitude. If you're being forced to work for a union, which in essence is what happens when you take a job at a unionized employer and are forced to pay union dues, you're not giving your consent to that relationship. You should not have to pay a middleman at a private organization like a union just to get or keep your government job. With collective bargaining, the union also inserts itself between the government employer and its employees and sours the relationship. The union sets up an us versus them mindset by casting its demands as a fight for employees' rights against the employer. As a result, employees tend to be more connected to their union than to their employer. The government has transferred part of its boss function over its own employees to the union, while retaining its full responsibility to pay their salaries. One of the arguments against privatizing a lot of government functions like the police, jails, and schools is that these functions are too important to be subject to market forces. But if these critical functions shouldn't be subject to Adam Smith's invisible hand of the market, they certainly should not be subject to the iron fist of the unions. The market, in contrast to the union, would keep salaries, benefits, and retirement packages for government workers at market norms, would increase productivity, and would improve the fiscal health of our nation significantly. Back in a minute. Thank you. Good faith leads to bad bargains. Another important right that the government gives up when it lets the union fox into its henhouse is the right to walk away from the table in negotiations with the union. The terms of the collective bargaining agreement compel the government to bargain with the union in good faith. So, the union employer cannot walk away from the bargaining table, but must continue bargaining with the union until agreement is reached, or in most cases, face binding arbitration. This means unelected arbitrators get the final decision on the terms of employment contracts between our government and its employees. Unlike the government's own negotiators, the arbitrators make the decision based on what they consider fair, regardless of its cost and how the state will pay for it. This means arbitrators actually have the power to force a state or municipality to raise taxes by granting costly concessions to the unions and government employees. As economist Charles Baird explains, quote, an arbitrator in government sector labor disputes is unelected but has power unilaterally to determine the size of government payrolls and thus significantly affect state fiscal priorities. Some states have been forced to raise taxes to pay arbitrators' awards, unquote. Baird calls this a form of taxation without representation. Once the arbitrator approves a concession, the state or locality is left to figure out how to pay for it. But politicians may not mind arbitration because they can blame the arbitrator for overly generous terms in union contracts, giving politicians political cover against criticism from other constituents. Strike. The biggest problem with unionization of government workers is strikes. In theory, organizing workers into labor unions is supposed to promote labor peace because there's an organized procedure for workers and employers to work out their differences. In reality, unionizing workers increases the number of work stoppages and strikes, whether legal or illegal. A frequently quoted labor truism is, quote, the only illegal strike is an unsuccessful one, unquote. When strikes are successful, strikers negotiate for amnesty for their illegal strike activity. So, no strike clauses don't have the teeth needed to actually prevent strikes. Strikes are not only a problem for our nation, but also for the workers themselves. Union members don't have any rights to call on whether or not their union calls a strike. Union themselves decides how to call a strike, which may include a vote by union members, but may just involve a decision by union officers. And of course, if the union calls a strike, union members lose their pay and receive only strike pay from the union, which is generally a lot less. So a prolonged strike can cause members significant financial hardship. Strikes are more pernicious when undertaken by government workers than in the private sector. If workers in a toothpaste factory go on strike, using one of President Reagan's favorite examples, people can just buy a different type of toothpaste. The business owner loses, but the community doesn't suffer much. But what happens when the police or firefighters in your city go on strike? Other than a few private security firms out there, the government has a monopoly on protecting citizens from crime and fire. If the police or firefighters in your community go on strike, whether their union-negotiated contract permits them to do so or not, who are the citizens in that community going to call? The power given to the labor unions over government workers is far more ominous for public safety workers than for mere pencil pushers. As one commentator put it, collective bargaining is less of a problem when, quote, the maintenance men of a public zoo are authorized to compel public bargaining than when soldiers, policemen, firefighters, public school teachers, and garbage men have such authority, unquote. If government workers who provide essential services to our nation are organized and can strike, whether legally or illegally, the community faces a real threat. This is one of the reasons that Congress prohibited collective bargaining over certain national security employees, the FBI, the CIA, and the Secret Service. We just can't have the men and women who are responsible for our national security called off the job for a strike. But as we will see in Chapter 4, the Obama administration permitted the Transportation Security Administration to unionize, creating a big chink in our national security armor. Other national security employees and civilian military employees have been unionized as well, which could leave our nation defenseless and exposed in case of strikes. Back in a minute. Thank you. Chapter 1, Summary Points. Union bosses pay themselves rich salaries by getting you to foot the bill. Of the 125 million people working in America, only about 13% are represented by a union. But of the 20.5 million people working for our government, 41% are represented by a government employee union. 1 in 3 federal workers is represented by a union. 35% of state workers and almost 47% of local workers are unionized, and as much as 60 to 70% of government employees are unionized in certain heavily unionized states. 2 in 3 teachers, police officers, and firefighters are unionized. Government service is now more lucrative than the private sector. Federal workers can earn 30 to 40% more in salary and benefits and 22% more in cash salary than they would earn in the private sector with the same skills. There are over 459,000 federal workers making over $100,000 in salary, over 1 in 5 of all federal civil service workers. Federal employees get up to 10 weeks of paid leave per year, or almost the equivalent of working only 4 days a week. Government workers retire at full pension substantially earlier than private sector workers retire. The key to union wealth and power is forced dues contract provisions, which are permitted in 26 states and practiced in at least 22. Federal, state, and local government employees work on union matters for about 23 million hours annually while being paid by the government. This official time costs the American taxpayers over $1 billion per year. Government employee unions can cripple America's economy, communities, and national security via strikes. Right-to-work laws protect workers against being forced to pay dues to a union in 24 states. But in 17 of these states, government workers can still be forced under union collective bargaining control. And that was the summary of Chapter 1. And next time we will start Chapter 2, called The Iron Fist. Thank you. Who is the socialist? He is the man that is spiritual. He's the man that seeks consensus. He's subjective, petty, and small, taking everything in life personally. He's outrageous, boring, and rude. He pretends to be a leader and a change agent. He pretends that he's your friend. He is sly, cunning, and deceptive. He dresses, acts, and speaks like a slob. He is informal and terminally unique. He is childish and pretends that he knows nothing. He has no conscience and pretends that might makes right and that the ends justify the means. He is impulsive and rationalizes his behavior. He is deterministic, blaming others for his mistakes. He is skeptical, demanding that others solve his problems. His unreasonableness and irresponsibility make him a bad role model, bad father, brother, family member, friend, and a bad person, period. So if you think that you can be friends with a socialist, think again. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you to tune in to the John and Ken Show, which is an excellent example of how true conservatives communicate. It's a radio show that's on KFI AM 640 from 2 o'clock in the afternoon to 6 o'clock in the evening, Monday through Friday. And that's Pacific time. So that's an excellent show to listen to. And other than that, until next time, remember to be honest, to be smart, to be beautiful, and to remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.